Mark Juergensmeyer, you're a sociologist who have studied religion and violence for many years. Is that a more urgent question today than 25 years ago?
Well, 25 years ago was at the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the era of globalization. So the answer is yes. There are more instances of violence, and they are identified with religion. But let's make it clear, this doesn't mean that religion is violent. I mean, it's not like suddenly religion has gone bad, like milk that was left out too long at night. But religion has often been associated with new forms of violence that are usually directed towards the nation state, kind of the collapse of that pattern of secular nationalism that kind of controlled and demarcated the world before the end of the Cold War. And in this changes, new forms of ethnic and religious identity are surfacing.
Why religion?
Well, why not? In the sense that the alternative to the collapse of secular nationalism is to look back at those traditional associations that one can rely on as kind of a rock in times of social turmoil. And so social identities based on ethnicity and religion naturally are the kind of rock that one associates with in a time of great change. In an era of globalization, there are three big issues. One is identity. Who are we? Because everybody can live everywhere. One is accountability. Who's really in charge? And the third is security. How can we be safe? And religion responds to all three of these. So there's no surprise that religion would be identified with new forms of social identity in a globalized world.
So this is really a question of questioning the secular state.
It's a questioning of who are we in an era where the secular state no longer makes sense the way it used to. And I think this is something that all of us have to confront. And all of us feel some sense of unease as the whole nature of social and national identity changes in an era of globalization.
Why is this happening now, that the religion gets into the scene this way?
Well, it's happening now because globalization is happening now, and it's happening everywhere. This is not a problem with one particular religion. There are strident, extreme forms of religiosity in every religious tradition. It's not just in Islamic countries, but in extreme forms of Christian politics in the United States and Europe, extreme forms of Buddhism in Myanmar and Sri Lanka. Just a couple of months ago, I was talking with a Buddhist monk in Myanmar who wanted to destroy the Muslims in his country because he thought that the only pure form of Burmese nationalism was a Buddhist Burmese nationalism. Well, that's kind of using religion to try to think of a way in which the notion of nationalism could be preserved in an era of globalization. And that's happening everywhere.
When this happened, what is the responsibility and challenge for people of faith and religious organizations when religion is used this way?
Well, I think, for one thing, not to despair and not to think that religion isn't what it's always been for most people, a comfort and a rock, a sense of security. And for most people, that's precisely what it continues to be in this particular global era. But I think it's also, you should recognize that the extreme forms of religiosity that some people have taken and the kind of violence and terrorism is not emblematic of their faith. We can't blame the billions of Muslims on the planet for what a few extremists do. And we can't blame all Christians for what Anders Breivik does in Norwich or Timothy McVeigh does in the United States, and their attempts to try to salvage Christendom in their imagination. They don't represent all Christians, and Muslim extremists don't represent all Muslims.
What is the solution on this from your point of view?
Well, I think we're in a time of change, historical change, and I think we're moving towards a new era of globalization, a new era of global identity, where there will be global systems of accountability and where people will become more comfortable living among people of different traditions and cultures and faiths in multicultural societies. And as that emerges, the kind of extreme defensiveness and reaction to it, I think will also change. But I think it's important in the interim not to overreact. And I think this is especially true for policymakers, to not try to crush in military ways the extremists, even when it's the violence, even when the extremism is in of a violent sort. Obviously, people need to be held accountability for their actions. They need to be stopped. They need to be punished in standard forms of judicial hearings and trials. But to imagine that we're in a war of terrorism, I think is really adding fuel to the fire. It's buying into this kind of notion of cosmic war that helps to perpetuate the acts of violence in the first place.
I know that you speak to political leaders and decision makers. Do they listen? Do they understand what you say?
I think the hardest thing for any policymaker to understand is that they are also part of the problem. Because we want to think that crazy things are done by other people. But often crazy things are done by other people because they are responding to what they see as our crazy things. We don't think what we're doing is crazy. But to try to understand the relationship and the sense of kind of oppression and the kind of heavy hand that globalization takes culturally, economically, politically around the world, and the way it's often associated with American and European hegemony, I think is a kind of a stretch of thinking that's very important in order to understand our role, and ours as Westerners, Europeans and Americans, in the kind of confrontation and the attempt to try to regain a sense of identity around the world.
You have met a lot of these people who are often labeled terrorists or who inspires. How would you describe these people?
Normal. You know, I met with Ashen Viratu, the Buddhist monk in Myanmar a couple months ago, who was on the cover of Time magazine as the Buddhist face of terror. And I think I was the first person to interview him after this picture came out on the cover with this label of Buddhist terrorist. And he just smiled when he saw me and he laughed and he said, "Do I look like a terrorist?" And I wanted to say, "You look like all the terrorists that I talk with," because I don't know what you think a terrorist is, but they're normal-looking people, and only they get solemn and they get intense only when they begin to talk about the role of faith in politics and how there's a war going on, a dramatic conflict, and we need to defend our culture and our faith, and that's when they get very serious. So these are people who are not pathologically skewed. Their view of the world may be skewed, and we may see them as not understanding the kind of forces of social change around us in the way that could lead to a more rational and calmer response. But as persons, they feel like they are just normal people taking up a sword of faith and defending their culture in a time of change.
What could change this? Is dialogue the answer, or what is the answer?
I think understanding is certainly a part of the answer. These are often not situations you can easily negotiate because people act out of kind of violence only when they see the world at war, when they imagine themselves and caught up in a great cosmic confrontation, a great battle between good and evil and right and wrong and religion and irreligion. So in such a kind of we-they view of the world, you're either with them or against them. There's no middle ground. So understanding, I think, is very important. Making clear that multi-faith communities are possible, that make sense, that one doesn't have to live in such a we-they kind of defensive attitudes towards other faiths and other traditions or towards secular nationalism, that it's possible to live in peace and calm among one's brethren from other traditions. I think that's the signal that needs to be sent.
We see a lot of people coming from the Middle East right now, especially Syria. What is the response from Europe? What could we do to ease up or help that situation in Syria and in the Middle East who makes people flee?
Oh, I think it's very important to welcome people. They've been through such a traumatic experience in their life. The young people especially feel alienated, they feel marginalized, they feel cut off from their tradition. To somehow make them feel at home. I mean, these are young people who could easily become very angry. They could be recruited by jihadists if they felt that there was no place for them in European society, so or American society, wherever they become refugees. So I think it's not just to be hospitable, but it's to be politically savvy, to welcome people of different traditions, especially people who have gone through such a traumatic experience as suffering through war and having to leave their homeland. Nobody wants to leave their homeland. None of these Syrians want to leave Syria. They would love desperately to go back. It's not as if they're trying to exploit what we have because they think they would be better off. Yes, they think they would be better off, but only because life is so tragic and the war is such a terrible experience back in their homeland. And so I think it's important for us to welcome such people and to try to make them feel at home.
We have a debate going on now in Europe and also in Sweden if the answer to this is kind of tougher rules, close the border, more sufficient and so on. What do you think is the solution from a European and Swedish point of view?
Well, there's always a problem just in terms of resources. If you're flooded with thousands or hundreds of thousands of people from abroad, but there has to be a two-pronged solution. You have to help people in their immediate circumstance, and just simply on a humanitarian level, there's no way you can avoid doing that. I mean, Turkey, for example, is experiencing millions of refugees fleeing over its borders. I was just in Kurdistan in northern Iraq, a region of 6 million people, and 2 million of them are refugees from the parts of Iraq and Syria that ISIS controls. And they are so welcoming, and they're so generous, really. So I think in the immediate short run, we need to respond to an immediate problem. But we also need to work at a solution in the Syrian and Iraqi situation so that people can return to their homeland. Maybe not all of them will, but certainly most of them will. They want to go back to their homes, their places that they're familiar with. So if we want to have a solution in the long run, we would help to try to cure the problems that created the tensions and the conflict in the first place.
Do you think that or how would you say that would be possible to cure the problem?
Well, this is a situation of political diplomacy and trying to work with the governments in Baghdad and Damascus in order to bring the Sunni populations of those two countries more welcomingly, in a more welcoming fashion into the government so they feel like they have a place. Only then really will the extremists, and particularly of ISIS, be undercut, because ISIS feeds on this Sunni resentment, the resentment of Sunni Muslims to the politics of Iraq, where Shia Muslims are in control, and they marginalize their Muslim brothers, but they're Sunnis, they're from a different region of Iraq. And in Syria, where the majority are Sunni, and yet the minority is of an Alawite kind of Shia community, and they marginalize the Sunni majority. So recognizing that this needs to take place and having a kind of diplomatic encounter that would involve not just Europe and the United States, but also Iran and Russia, there are multiple forces that can come into play and make a difference. And these are the things that need to be done in order for there to be a long-range solution.
You have also said that the conflict in Israel-Palestine has become more religious the last 25 years. In what way do that makes this conflict different and make it a solution easier or worse?
Well, you always hear that, how can you possibly solve the problem in Israel and Palestine, because Jews and Muslims have been at each other's throats in that part of the world for centuries, and they haven't. That's simply not true. I don't know who told you that, but that's not true. And this has been a religionized conflict only really in the last 25 years or so. It wasn't until around 1990 and the first Intifada that the Palestinian movement became religionized with the Hamas movement led by Sheikh Yassin. Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the main Palestinian movement, was secular. His wife wasn't even Muslim. She was Christian. She was Palestinian Christian. But it was not a religious movement in any sense. It was, I think, only the frustration that nothing was happening that then the movement became increasingly a kind of religious movement with the kind of extraordinary hope that religion can bring to a conflict. And it's one of the reasons why some of these conflicts are religionized out of frustration. If you imagine them to be a religious struggle, well then, if God is on your side, if this is God's war, then somehow we can win, even though it looks like we can't win, even though it looks like things are impossible. And on the Jewish side, it's also true. Israel was created to be a secular country. I mean, to be a haven for Jews, to be sure, but primarily as a secular vision. And it was only fairly recently that some extremists began to think of Israel as biblical Israel, as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, as a recreating biblical Israel and the Davidic kingship and the temple on Temple Mount that you would, and taking over all of the West Bank, which is biblical lands, you would create the conditions for the coming of the Messiah. That's an extraordinary vision, but that's not the vision that most Israeli Jews have. It's a very small group, but they have so made their point, and they have such a kind of political leverage in Israel that the politics of the country has been veering more towards the right and more in this kind of extremist direction. But that's very new. So the religionization of the conflict on both the Jewish and on the Muslim side, both the Palestinian and the Israeli side, is fairly recent. And I think if we understand that, we understand it can also change. It doesn't need forever to be thought of in exaggerated religious terms. It can be taken as just a human problem of negotiation, of trying to make it possible for two groups of people to live in a very close quarters, amicably, peacefully, and with mutual respect.
We always said very that it's always only political. No